Salutations, dear viewers, and welcome to another episode of the Politics of Discretion podcast. Today, I want to break a rule I've been trying to institute over myself, and which is to get away from politics, and I want to actually talk about partisan politics. Now, you might think that shirking away from political discussion is an odd decision for someone who runs a website that has politics in the header to go with, but my complaint is primarily that politics, which is, according to the Aristotelian definition, and I tend to like Aristotle on a lot of things, is really just the art of governing. And it is about, not what is unique to us as individuals, because those are private issues and outside the realm of government, but about the issues that apply to things we hold in common, things that go beyond purely private concerns. Thomas Paine talks about civil liberties really being defined as things that we can procure through our own self-sufficiency, and anything that goes beyond that is not really a right. And that's where the law steps in and is supposed to be an aid, really, in helping to procure those things that by dint of our natural rights we would like to enjoy, but that really require an extra sort of oversight function to make sure that, since we're then forced to deal with others, we're introducing the possibility of harm and of abuse, and the law then steps in to make sure that there is this egalitarian playing field in regards to the way that we all hold rights. It doesn't go any further than that, because that's when tyranny starts to occur. That really is what politics should be about, and that means it should be about policy and really exacting arguments about exactly what constitute civil liberties and civil rights, because the Constitution is not clear, and the Constitution is specifically not clear because the founders were afraid that if they listed something that looked like a comprehensive list of rights, it would lead to the conclusion wrongly that anything not listed was not a right, and that's not the case. As we know from the 9th and the 10th Amendments, the states and the people, states are constitutive parts of the polity, remember, states and the people have rights not listed in the Constitution, and then it's up to the people to sort of fight that out amongst themselves and come to a consensus as to how governance should occur and what private society should look like. But this, sadly, is not what politics is about anymore, much to my increasing frustration as someone who holds a political science degree and who began in political opinion, well, not journalism, but commentary, let's say. But increasingly, and we knocked the 2016 election, but if you go back to the 2012 election, you can see the roots of ridiculousness starting to spread there, and really it goes back even farther than that. But there is this increasingly voyeuristic fascination with personality, with power politics, with scandal and intrigue, and this very almost a prurient desire to just harp upon the failings of people and to tie it to the failures of political bodies and organs. Now, certainly there's political dysfunction. The degree to which that's a problem is, I think, somewhat overblown, because the federal government was never designed to do much of what it does now, so of course it's going to go wrong. And I think really there's no institutional malfunction that's responsible for that, so much as simply the fact that Congress has superseded its purposes and has really run adrift of the framework that it was given by the founders. And if we would return to that and return to federalism and devolve power back down to the state and local levels, then a lot of what we consider to be problematic would still be problematic, but it would be on state and local levels where people who are qualified to have the arguments that we are supposed to be having about policy could have them and could govern more effectively. But that is a discussion for another time, even though I've spent the past 5 minutes harping on it. But to get back to this idea of the voyeurism of politics, this hyper obsession with scandal, with anytime someone says something that we don't like, that is suddenly a major news story. If you read The Hill, and that I do, that's where I get a lot of my news, at least to begin with, before I go on and read other things. There is this constant popping up of stories that have to do with what one senator tweeted or what one said in another that might be taken as a slur, or of course the president's Twitter feed. And this is of course not to say that these politicians aren't engaging in behaviors that they shouldn't, and that we should have a more restrained debate. And I don't think that civility is necessarily a good standard for government. If you want to insult people, sure, insult people, but do it in a way that it's tied to something substantive. I think we should call people out when they make claims and then walk them back, because that's bad politics, and that contributes to rising feelings of inefficacy. But it's not based in that. It's all based in character smears and taunts and, nasty little schoolyard epithets. And particularly since the 2016 election, and I think again you can see it beginning to burgeon in the 2012 election, there is this growth of what we're now referring to as tribalism. And this, it's also populist too, this us versus them sentiment among Democrats and Republicans. And you can see the flipping of positions as each gains a foothold on power. When the Democrats are in control, they behave a certain way. They believe that government is a force for good, and there's really nothing that the government can do wrong. Corruption and waste and mismanagement are sort of, swept under the rug. Obama administration scandals like the IRS targeting scandal, like Fast and Furious, they're sort of painted away as not something that we need to really investigate, but something that is just a Republican talking point to try to derail government. And, of course, the Republicans in opposition under Obama screamed and yelled about things like deficits, screamed and yelled about things like bureaucratic overreach and executive overreach. Now flip the positions, the Republicans are in charge, and it's the Republicans who are talking down scandals like with the EPA, where there's pretty obviously waste and abuse that's going on. This is the kind of thing that would have been red meat for the Republican base 4 years ago. Suddenly it's not that big of a deal to a lot of people. Suddenly, at the same time, Democrats are now the ones who are making cases for federalism, for accountability in government, when 4 years ago they were the ones who believed that the federal government was a force for good and shouldn't really be questioned too thoroughly. We're back to the idea that dissent is the highest form of patriotism on the left, when under Obama, if you questioned the president, you were probably going to be called a racist because you couldn't possibly have any intellectual disagreements with the great social programs that Obama was trying to advance. And beyond the fact that this is just rank hypocrisy of the most intellectually degenerate strain, right? This idea that we flip-flop and seesaw depending upon what position we hold, right? Everything is relative. Politics is relative to one's position in power. It's not rooted in anything durable like principle. In fact, the entire self becomes determined by one's position in power and changes entirely, and that is a real problem if we believe in representative government and the ability to elect people who are essentially they're given the charge of representing the public interest. They're proxies for the self-interest and for the desired ends of the people. But if representatives are then concerned with their position in power, and practicality becomes the gauge of how one behaves, indeed becomes the gauge of the very position that one takes, then there's no really durable self. And it's important that for politicians there is a durable self, there is a consistent record, because the people need something to objectively analyze, to say Congressman X has been my representative for 10 years, and now that the next election is coming up, I need to sit back and look at his record and decide whether or not I like how he's governed or not. And if there's no consistency to the way that Congressman X behaves, if he really sort of prostitutes himself out to power and changes his entire being to try to propagate his own position, to propagate the party's position, and becomes opportunistic in the way he votes, because there's this consideration above everything else to practicality, and to the idea that, well, we need to game certain issues so that the question is not, are they good policy? The question is, can they pass? And our record is about nothing so much as how many laws have we successfully passed. Then it's very hard for the constituent to sit back and get a good feel of whether or not that particular congressman has actually served their interests, whether or not they have even behaved as an honest actor, because they have so contradicted themselves, they have so utterly reinvented themselves time and time again to meet with changing situations, that there is no one person there. It's all mutable and changeable. And it becomes very hard to make objective opinions. And it's very important in a representative government that there is some standard of objectivity. That because we're entrusted with political power, because the people are the ultimate source of political right and wrong, which effectively gives a subjective tinge to politics that is very dangerous if it's not constrained to individual self-interest, and to the idea that when I go to the voting booth, I'm looking for people who not only are going to take certain positions on bills that I'm amenable to, but are also just holders of principles that I agree with. If we don't root that in something durable, then, we have effectively become nothing more than a democracy, which is just mob rule. Except in this case, it's not so much mob rule in the sense that there is only there's only majority rule, and whatever the majority says goes. But you have a majority that is in politics, at least in the channels of power, that is actively molding itself to that power to try and gain a greater foothold. So its positions are determined by what it thinks will appease the majority, and you have this very dangerous sentiment that derives from that, where we start to marginalize dissenters, and we start to cast them as as people who stand in the way of progress, people who stand in the way of the public good. And that's the problem with the modern democratic sentiment that we have, is there's a morality that is imbued to the majority, and not even to the majority in terms of numbers, but in terms of consensus government, and that whatever is most whatever advances the public good is where public opinion should follow, is where congressional action should follow. And if you stand against that, then in a certain abstract regard, not in a physical regard, but in a certain philosophical way, then you're a threat, and you need to be mitigated and sort of shunted to the side and made obsolete in terms of your influence over policy. And that is not the multiplicity of factions that Madison had in mind. We need to pay deference to dissenting voices. But all of this is to get to the point of tribalism. And what is ultimately, I think, the problem with tribalism is not just that it is relative, not just that it is really reflexive and it is a response to what someone else does, but that the entire reason for being for much of modern political platforms, particularly in terms of Democrats and Republicans, is that it is because it's tied to this voyeuristic sense of belittling one's political opponents. It has become really hollow. And what I mean by that is if you look at what drives, opposition research and so much of campaigning these days, it's a desire to really do harm to the other party. Again, not physically, but in philosophical terms and in emotional terms too. There's a sense of thrill that one gets from seeing the failure of one's political enemies. And indeed, Democrats increasingly view Republicans as their political enemies, and Republicans view Democrats as their political enemies. And that's a problem, which is not to say that, if you're a Republican, you should not view democratic ideas with contempt and disdain. You probably should, because you think that they're ultimately incorrect and that they're a bad foundation for the country. And Democrats think the same thing about Republican ideas. But there's a difference between thinking that on a philosophical level and then being able to have a discussion with someone from the opposing party about why you think those ideas are wrong, and ultimately bowing to the reciprocal principle of right, which says that any freedom that you love in yourself, you must respect in another. So if I love my right to my mind, which is what allows me to form opinions about good or bad, and to then extrapolate that into what I think good public policy is, I have to respect the same right in someone who disagrees radically with me. And that means that we should have debate. And indeed, the very idea of philosophic freedom, of the right to conscience, means that you have to have debate, because you can't know without intellectual exploration, which means that you have to confront ideas that you disagree with, whether strongly or slightly. So there needs to be sort of a across the grain debate, across the grain engagement. And you can't have that when you're convinced that someone who thinks differently than you is just desirous of pulling the country apart and of dismantling your way of life, and sort of standing over you and gloating as you lie on the floor, distraught because your side has lost. And this sentiment, this us versus them dichotomy, is really a facet of populist thought. And increasingly, though, it's become tied to the culture wars, which again gets to my point that all of politics is no longer about actual policy and governance. It's now about voyeurism. It's now about looking at the lives of one's political opponents and sort of reveling in the fact that your political opponents are humans and they have character failings, and sometimes they don't do the right things. And in taking that and exploiting it to its fullest and understanding political failure in terms of, well, this person is just a bad actor, and sort of making moral judgments about the quality of that person, and then taking those moral judgments and imputing them to political motives and indeed to the institutional failures of government. So we increasingly see politics through this lens of the personal, and that's tied to the populist us versus them dichotomy of anyone who's not with me is against me, and is not just against me in terms of the fact that they disagree, but is actively trying to subvert me, to subvert what I believe in, and to subvert my lifestyle. And so much of politics now is driven by this, and this desire to actively do harm to one's political opponents as sort of a preemptive strike, as, well, they're out to get me, so I'm going to get them first, and then sit back and laugh because I've won and they've lost. And part of the problem with this, I think, is that it promotes a sense of self, which is effectively not a sense of self, because one's whole being, one's whole constitution, and in fact, the very modes of life that become adopted are then located exterior to the self. If you're a Republican who revels in the current administration because it causes great pain to Democrats, then really your whole being is centered in the idea that that Democrats are the enemy and that Democrats need to be mitigated and need to be kept out of the organs of power. And anytime that Republican policies are advanced, then it's Democrats who are hurt. And that's good for you because Democrats are against you. And the common theme to this is all harm to the Democrats. So yourself is all really bound up in an agent who is external to the self. And your mood rises or falls depending on what happens to that actor. So it's really an outsourcing of self-identity. And the same is also true of Democrats in their view of Republicans. I don't, even though we're talking in terms of political dichotomies, I don't mean to promote one over the other. I think they're both equally as bad as themselves, and they deserve the other. They're both wildly hypocritical in their positions, and we here value consistency and intellectual integrity, which neither party currently holds. So, aside from that, there's this locating of the self in the other, and when you do that, when you give over your whole being to another actor whom you claim to hate, you are not actually mitigating them. You're not actually emerging victorious over them, but you're actually allowing them to rule you, because your whole being is constituted not by things that you value as a person, things that your rational mind, your consciousness has perceived and decided are things that are worth upholding, things that are worth championing, but rather the positions that you hold and the actions that you take are a response to an external actor and the belief that they are bad, and that not that what the opposite of what they believe is good in and of itself, but that anything that denigrates the thing that the other actor upholds is bad. So it's not an active seeking out of merit. It's not a positive way of being, because it is a negative response to the external actor, and it is a desire to put them down. It's not a desire to actually promote the opposite ideology of what they hold because they believe that it's, or rather because you believe that it's good, but it's good simply in reference to the fact that it is the opposite of what your enemy believes. And this effectively means that you are not a free and moral agent, and your entire being is constituted in really is a catalytic reaction to the other. And this is a very hollow and self-perpetuating sort of being. And really it is to sell oneself into slavery. It is not to rise above the whatever one dislikes in the other actor, because presumably we have negative role models. We see people who do things that we don't like, who hold positions that we don't like, and we say there's something wrong with that. And I'm going to advocate for the other position because I believe that's good, and I don't want to be like this negative actor. So negativity can be a path towards enlightenment and a path towards finding positive values. And that doesn't root the self in an external actor, because in that case the self has gone through the value judgment process of saying this is bad, what's the opposite of that? Good. Well, I'm going to root myself in good and advance good. And in that case the actor has taken control of themselves and has gone through that rational process and determined for themselves what they think good and bad values are, and orients their actions around attempting to promote them. Tribalism, on the other hand, modern political tribalism, and the left-right divide is not proactive. It's not really agential, because you have Democrats who are orienting their political behavior around just a desire to get rid of Republicans. Anything the Republicans stand for is bad, and we're going to try and tear that down. Not really even advocate positive values of our own, but just stand against whatever the Republicans say and get them out of power so that we can get into power. And then Republicans turn around and do the exact opposite and say, well, what the Democrats want is bad because they're against us, so we're just going to oppose the Democrats. And everything that that party does is then oriented around getting rid of the enemy. It's not being a positive force for good. And you can see that in the relativity of our politics, right? Tying this back to this earlier point that I made about how the parties flip-flop depending upon power. Their entire being is in reference to their position in government, to whether or not they're in the majority or the minority, because they don't actually stand for anything themselves. They stand against their opponent. Their whole being is located exterior to themselves in their opponent and is molded simply by a desire to be something other than what the opponent is. And that ultimately, again, is not compatible with a representative system of government, because that requires that individuals take responsibility for being the primary agential force in their own life. And what I mean by that is the entire concept of a federalistic government, right, where we have the U.S. federal government that has the ultimate power, but really only has the ultimate power in a very specific set of areas, right? The enumerated powers in Article 1 of the Constitution, right? And I'm talking about America as it is meant to function, not as it currently functions. But so you have the federal government, and it has this very truncated little area over which it is sovereign. And then below that, you have the states, who exist in a much broader area. And what is politically right and wrong in the states is much different, is an entirely different question, because they are sovereign, except in those areas where the federal government has the ultimate authority. And that means that the states act and make determinations, and the states ultimately are only the political level to which issues are brought to be solved when localities cannot settle something, when, to get back to Thomas Paine's idea, when there is something that individuals in their communities lack the resources to solve, when they need a power broker with more authority, with more resources to settle a dispute. And the entirety of that system rests on the principle that individuals take up freedom in their own lives and are proactive actors and actively, seek out values, actively seek out ends that are value driven. And when there is some sort of a problem in their own life, they do something to try and rectify it. They take proactive measures, and they do so in a way that is in line with their values, and they engage constantly with society and what goes on around them. There's not this idea that politics is something that we just think about for 10 minutes before we go to the polling booth. It is a constant process in one's life. And indeed, the political sphere is much more truncated, but within the private sphere, one needs to become particularly active and particularly engaged with value and in promoting value and in being a really jealous guardian of one's own right. And if one sees something that one believes is negative or believes is an infringement, if it's just a negative interaction, say with like a business or a neighbor, then one avoids them because one doesn't want to promote them. But if it's an actual infringement of rights, then one does something about that in government. One either goes to the appropriate council that can deal with it and becomes really active in lobbying for reform, or one enters government oneself and does something to promote a set of values that is more consistent with the kind of free lifestyle that one has. But all of that requires that individuals take responsibility for themselves, that they don't sit back and anytime there's a conflict anywhere in society, run to Congress and say, solve this for us. And then sit back and complain about how bitter and divisive politics has become. Well, of course it's become bitter and divisive because we've rooted it in personality, because we've really defaulted on our responsibilities in our own lives. And that is the problem with tribalism, is it's not just the outsourcing of politics. It's also the outsourcing of self, and the idea then that in tribalism and in populism, one's personality, one's whole being is really not something that one is a proactive force in. It's more of a response to some hated other. And by reacting in the way that populists do and sort of catalyzing personal being as a means of engaging in a, Captain Ahab style monomaniacal crusade against the hated white whale, that is to give that other force complete control over one's being. You're not actually mitigating it. You're not actually eroding its power in any way. In fact, you're cementing its power over yourself. You're giving it complete and total power over yourself. Really, you're selling yourself into slavery to it. And that has become, sadly, the root of our modern political discourse, our modern political parties. And the only thing that can solve that is if people start actually taking responsibility for themselves again and start actively thinking and start promoting a value-oriented politics, and one that is not just, well, I'm a Republican and I don't like Democrats and Democrats don't like me, so I need to get rid of the Democrats, or I'm a Democrat and I hate Republicans and Republicans hate me, so anything that undermines the Republicans, I'm for. There's no conscious thought, that kind of a society is hollow, and essentially it drifts listlessly. There's no purpose to any of it. There's no agency to any of it. It's sort of a self-perpetuating cycle that cannibalizes itself to keep moving. And that is ultimately incompatible with a representative style of government, which requires that individuals be agents in their own lives.